Imagine, you're a Japanese child growing up in 1990. You're over a friend's house, and you're playing a new RPG by Nintendo called Fire Emblem. It's not quite like Dragon Warrior or Final Fantasy, but you find it's still fun all the same. You look to your friend and go, "In 30 years, this game will let me have tea with large-breasted women." And your friend turns to you and goes, "Do yata ego hanasu no." But my terrible attempts to pronounce an Oriental language aside, it does seem like a completely different series. I mean, how could this go to this? It just seems like such a stark difference. But what if I told you that this isn't nearly as bizarre a change if we just took one foot in front of the other? I want to take us on a walk throughout the entire series, step by step, and explain how the series has changed and how it's gone over its characters over time. Note that this is purely in its writing for its characterization. I'm not here to talk about gameplay changes unless they relate to how the characters are presented. So if you want to hear someone bitch about casual mode, I'm afraid this isn't the place for you. You'll have to find that elsewhere. But if you want to learn how we got characters with well-explained trauma and character development from the series that had Daros became Sail, then, well, stick around for a moment or two and I'll show you the way. Where else to begin but with where it all began? Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, as you might expect, the idea of making well fleshed out characters in a 50-plus man roster on the same system that had Wahoo Plumberman stomping on mushrooms sounds absurd. And you would be absolutely correct, because they aren't. In Fire Emblem 1, like most RPGs at the time, it was fairly bare bones in its writing. Most characters would show up, say one line, and then vanish, never to be seen again. So you might ask yourself, what, are we just gonna skip over this game and get to the other ones? No. While Fire Emblem 1 doesn't have much in regards to character writing, it does have this teensy little mechanic you might have heard of called permadeath. I know, kind of a minor thing. It was this mechanic that allowed you to bond with your characters. You didn't care about losing Barst because he was a well-developed and intricate character. You cared about losing Barst because he comes in with 9 fucking base speed. And the funny thing about Fire Emblem 1 permadeath, the game wasn't designed around you resetting. If you lost someone, you were supposed to just keep playing and soldier on. Because of this, the characters were meant to be bonded with in an almost purely gameplay sense. Hence why a lot of units are very similar in what they do. They were meant to replace the others if they died. You bonded with your knights and your mercenaries, not with Draug or Ogma. Gaiden didn't do too much in the character department during the game itself. If you weren't Alm or Celica, it's really hard to say you even had a personality. But it did add a nice touch for its endings. While character endings still largely boil down to a single line for a lot of the cast, that one line would be a little different if a certain other character died. For example, Bowie's regular ending reads, "As always, he did nothing but bicker with May. Perhaps, for the two of them, that is true happiness." If May is dead, however, it reads, "Now that May's gone before him, he realizes his own heart for the first time. However, time cannot be turned back." Wow, that is sad. This helped flesh out the characters a bit more, and as such, Gaiden's cast felt a bit more vibrant than Fire Emblem 1's. Mystery of the Emblem was largely the same from Fire Emblem 1. If you weren't Marth, odds are, you weren't going to stand out very much from a character perspective. There were minor exceptions, the White Wings and Minerva, the Wolf Guard, a few others, but largely characterization was kept to a minimum. But then, everything changed when Intelligent Systems released this little unknown game called Genealogy of the Holy War. This was where Fire Emblem characters stopped being one line and done, and started being something more fleshed out and dynamic. See, one of Fire Emblem 4's biggest mechanics is marriage. Two characters would fall in love if they stood near each other or after a set amount of time would have passed and married, which basically just means they can steal each other's money. You know, as God intended matrimony to be. But this gameplay mechanic was accompanied by conversations between potential lovers, which is what we're looking at here. A lot of these conversations boil down to, "You're really hot, here's a cool weapon," which, hey, why do we still try to woo women by buying them alcohol at bars when we could just be giving them swords and magical staffs to show our affection? But they do have more moments of the characters being characters, talking to each other, figuring stuff out between them, you know, that kind of thing. Sure, not every character got a whole lot of lines. As I showed earlier, Johann and Johalavir come to mind as kinda bare bones, but they still felt more like characters than just units. Thracia is a kind of return to form for the characterization from Fire Emblem 1 to 3. Characters come up, say a few lines, and then never speak again. But at the same time, those few lines are much more prevalent. Sure, you have characters like Dalsin or Hicks who really don't say a damn thing after they join, but you also have characters like Lithis and Safi that steal the show with their limited screen time. Safi opens her mouth maybe twice in the entire game, and I can distinctly remember everything she says in those 2 times. Thracia also fleshed out endings much more than previous entries. In Fire Emblem 1 to 3, endings were like a line at most for characters. In Fire Emblem 4, it was less that characters had their own endings and more so that countries had their own endings. Thracia's characters all got detailed endings, often giving them a more solid characterization than they got in-game, leading to a fleshed out, if not the most complex, cast of characters. Before we jump out of Kaga Emblem and get to Binding Blade, we need to make a quick note for BSFE, or Arcanea Chronicles, or Arcanea Saga, whatever the hell you want to call it, as it was released along this time as well, and was sort of a DLC almost for the Marth games. It gave 4 side stories taking place before Fire Emblem 1, fleshing out a few characters like Camus or Minerva. It helped flesh out those characters' backstories, but wasn't really anything special or noteworthy. Anyways, Binding Blade marked a huge turning point in the franchise. It was the first game without series creator Shozo Kaga, as he went off to do his own thing and disappear for 15 years, and it added the now series staple support conversations to the franchise. Yup, that mechanic that seems so synonymous with the series didn't make its appearance until the 6th entry. Crazy, ain't it? Now, I'm fairly certain everyone who's watching knows what support conversations are, but just in case, let's go over them real fast. You would put 2 of your units next to each other and, after a set amount of turns had passed that varied by the specific duo, they would have a conversation. These conversations allowed the characters to be more realized than ever before, and the dialogue ranged from fun topics like Trek keeping a little dream journal, to Faye finding Elfin really cute, to Ashtal having intense alcoholism due to his failure protecting King Hector. Fun! Fire Emblem 6 has a ton of support conversations too. Most characters had about 5 pairs, with 3 conversations each. Some got lucky enough to get blessed with 6 or 7, and Roy and Lilina had a whopping 10 pairs. This meant that all characters could have backstories and personalities that were more expanded upon than ever, and seemingly completely unassuming characters like Lot or Garrett had an interesting story to tell. Binding Blade did, however, drop the ball hard on endings. Oh, don't get me wrong, Binding Blade did have the longer endings from Thracia, giving each character a nice bow tie to their story, but there were 2 issues. 1, only Roy got paired endings with his 6 potential lovers and no one else, so any support that set up 2 characters doing something together got dashed by their endings. Klein and Tate confess their love for each other but then go home to their countries alone? Shit like that happens with way too many pairs. And the other issue is that the only characters whose extended endings you saw were the 10 units you took into the final chapter. The other 40 plus characters in the game that you didn't take just got the simple one-line endings from Fire Emblem 1. I guess they were trying to incentivize multiple playthroughs so that you could see all the supports in different routes, but the issue is there's no support replayer, so you have no idea who supports with whom. You just kinda have to guess. So while Fire Emblem 6 had, in my opinion, very great and fleshed out characters, actually seeing those characters was done in a very obtuse way. Fire Emblem 7 Blazing Sword introduced a huge change that isn't very huge in Fire Emblem 7. This was the first game to feature a player avatar, a tactician of the canonical name Mark, or for women, Mark. Truth be told, Mark doesn't change the game all that much. Hell, there's even an option to remove Mark in the story, and it doesn't really change anything. But it's important to note here, because this concept is going to be really big later down the line. Overall, Fire Emblem 7 didn't really change how the characters were presented from Fire Emblem 6. They just sort of polished the system. There was now a support viewer, allowing you to re-watch your supports and see who supported with who. All characters got proper endings regardless of if you used them in the final battle, and they expanded upon paired endings and gave them to characters who weren't just the lords, so more duos could have their stories end in a much more clean fashion. Fire Emblem 8, The Sacred Stones, didn't add a whole lot new to the table either, just 2 little further adjustments to the system. The first was that every ally in the game could be recruited in one run. In Fire Emblem 1 through 7, there were route splits and characters locked behind those splits, so there were characters locked behind a particular playthrough. Sacred Stones has a route split too, but it simply affects when you recruit characters, not if you recruit characters, so you can get everyone in one go. Unless you kill Eyes too quickly in Chapter 13 and completely missed Cormac spawning in, like I did when I was a kid. The other change Sacred Stones implemented is that they just offered more diversity in their paired endings. In Fire Emblem 4 and 6, all paired endings had to be romantic. In Fire Emblem 7, you could count the number of aromantic paired endings on one hand. In Sacred Stones, sure, there was still a heavy focus on romantic endings, but there were also more endings that were just between close friends or close family that allowed for more diverse stories to be told than ever before, which led to, in my opinion, one of the best casts in the entire series and JRPGs in general. Tellius both absolutely knocks the ball out of the park and then also sets the entire stadium on fire in how it handles its characters. For starters, Path of Radiance retweaks the support system from the Game Boy Advance games. You still have 3 conversations per duo, a total of 5 allowed per playthrough, but there are 2 major differences. First, they happen before the battle, not during, which really doesn't affect the content in them that much, but people complained about how silly it was, so I guess they thought the need to change it was apparent. The second change, and the much more substantial change to the support conversations, was that you no longer got them by standing on the ground next to each other for 50 million turns. Now, 2 units simply have to fight in a set amount of chapters together, and they will be allowed to engage in a support conversation. This not only makes it easier to get them in general, but it also allows for characters to interact about the story in a way that was just impossible before. In the Game Boy Advance games, 2 units could start supporting as soon as you got them, so the development within them could feel very rushed, and they also couldn't talk about story events unless those events happened before they joined your army. That's why Ellawood can't talk about his father's death in a support conversation with Marcus, but can with Harkin, even though his relationship with Marcus would make more sense for him to confide in him. But in Path of Radiance, since the game knows at what point in the story you are when you get to have a certain support conversation, the game can make mention of its events much easier. For example, Jill's ace support with Leith happens after 10 chapters of them fighting together, at which point Jill's father Shiraham has already been killed, allowing the 2 of them to talk about him. That would have been a thing that is completely impossible in the GBA support system. Its other major addition was the form of a home base. Before every chapter, you would be in a base menu where you could buy and forge weapons, engage in support conversations, inject bonus XP directly into Oscar's bloodstream, etc., etc. But there were also special base combos that you could do for every single chapter. These range from giving tips for how to fight in the next chapter, to getting a sweet item or a new unit, or to just let the characters have some downtime and be themselves. This really helped show the characters in a better light, and led to them feeling more real as a result. And then Radiant Dawn comes along and fucks up pretty much everything. For those unaware, back in the day, Radiant Dawn got ass blasted for one very common complaint. It removed the support conversations that were working so well in the last 4 entries. Oh, they're there in a gameplay sense, but now everyone supports with everyone, and the supports are just one line of dialogue that gets recycled for every character that fits a particular trope. Say, Ike will have a line for royalty, he'll have a line for common people, etc., etc. Now, from a gameplay perspective, that's all well and good. It allows for strategic management of support bonuses, etc. And the Path of Radiance characters are still themselves, even if most of them are a lot worse in Radiant Dawn. But this guts the characterization and development of Radiant Dawn's new characters. Who the hell even remembers that Gareth and Vika exist? Like, who the hell are these people? Hell if I know, Radiant Dawn certainly doesn't care about them. Especially poor Vika. That game really hates Tormod's gang for some reason. But credit where credit is due, the game does keep base conversations, and they are still pretty good. Stefan going into a cathartic fit of laughter after realizing God doesn't even know what the hell he is, genuinely one of my favorite moments in the series. But what were once the cherries on top of the support conversations now become the only thing we have for a lot of these characters. And some Radiant Dawn exclusive characters have so few lines it feels like they're from Fire Emblem 1 to 3. And now on to the best part of Radiant Dawn, when it's over. No, seriously, it actually handles endings very well. It combines the guide and idea of having characters' endings be altered if a certain someone else dies. For example, Morum's is edited if Tormod dies, and it takes the Game Boy Advance game's idea of paired endings between people that reach an A support, like... poor Astrid. But aside from starting the does Ike is gay debate that will likely persist and continue to go on until long after the fall of man, it didn't add anything lasting to the series' characters, and is kind of a genuine step backwards for them. And after a controversial entry like Radiant Dawn, Shadow Dragon was probably the last thing the series needed to release. Much like Radiant Dawn, Shadow Dragon was slandered back in the day for its complete lack of support conversations and the loss of the base conversations. And yeah, that's true. A lot of the cast is just as bare bones as they were back on the NES. However, I say a lot of the cast and not all of the cast for a reason. Shadow Dragon pumped up the story of Fire Emblem 1, and that does reflect on the characters. Shadow Dragon vastly improved the story writing from the original NES game, and so the characters that are integral to the story are improved as well. Yeah, funny how a better story means better characters. But Marth, Kaida, the White Wings, Nina, all of these characters got more conversations and writing to help flesh them out. Sure, most of the roster is still just, I have an axe, and not much else, so it's far from ideal, but it's a step in the right direction for Arcanea, even if it's a step backwards for the series overall. New Mystery of the Emblem is where things get interesting, because in this game, it is where one of the most controversial decisions in the series... No, not that one, I already said this wasn't the place for that. Yeah, there, that's the one. That's the decision. This game marks the return of the Avatar from Fire Emblem 7, but much more fleshed out. For better and for worse. Disregarding Chris and New Mystery of the Emblem's crimes against the story of Mystery of the Emblem, this is the game that marks the return of proper support conversations and base conversations, which help flesh out Arcanea's previously weak cast. Basically, everything that the combination of Shadow Dragon and Radiant Dawn cut, New Mystery brought back. However, having a lot of the character interactions be centered around a player avatar was a black hole that's... well, quite frankly, it's easier to describe in our next entry. And then came the big one, Fire Emblem Awakening for the 3DS, the game that introduced a whole bunch of fans to the series, and with it came a style of characterization that was both like everything before it and like nothing before it. Well, we might as well just dive right into this one, because this entry is what's known as a controversial game. Awakening's characterization was a strong shift away from the games prior. Now, some of the crowd will tell you that this is where Fire Emblem became bad and became anime. Whatever the hell they mean by that statement. But really, what happened was a shift away from more grounded characters into... I almost want to say romantic comedy characters. This is due to the introduction of the S support system, the support where two characters would fall in love and get married. This is a system that pretty much throws realism completely out the door in favor of whirlwind marriages that happen in 4 conversations. While former A supports might have had hints of romantic feelings between two characters, marriage was never what happened in the A support except for a single instance where the characters were established as knowing each other for years prior. Awakening has people that just met 3 days ago get married, and that could really be off-putting for a lot of people. And this shy away from realism reflected in the characters as well. They were a lot more gimmicky than before. It's like we went from a series full of Irks with few Sarahs to a series full of Sarahs with few Irks. And you might ask yourself, is that really such a bad thing? And I say it really comes down to preference. Sure, Awakening's characters aren't as realistic or well developed as the past 12 games, but at the same time, I can't lie. Their big personalities really can cause a smile and a laugh out of a lot of people, much more than the more down-to-earth cast could. And if I had to give a reason for that change in writing style, yeah, it's time to pin the blame on the Avatar. The characterization of the characters and the further emphasis on romance definitely pushes a heavy lean towards the ability to choose who you want to support as your Avatar self-insert. The way the characters act, the DLC CGs, the way they're just designed. Like, there's a reason only 3 recruitable characters in this game look like they're past the age of 23. The best example I can find to pinpoint this difference in writing style is how, in the Chrom male Robin support, it goes into Chrom's naive, trusting mentality and how he goes on to befriend people despite the risk of betrayal, giving a strong character moment for him and making him more 3-dimensional. And then in the female Robin support, they see each other naked and get hitched because of it. To me, that's really, really stupid. But that kind of rom-com interaction appeals to a much bigger demographic than a very deep intellectual conversation between two hetero life mates. And I can hear you asking me, well, why does it matter if characters aren't as complex or deep if they're still enjoyable to people? To which I say, yeah, no, you're right, you got a point, that's completely fair. What I see as tropey and annoying, you might see as fun and enjoyable, and that's completely fine. The main point here is that Awakening does things differently, not better or worse per se. Besides, hate on Awakening is old news. Now it's cool to hate on Fates. And has been cool for 5 goddamn years, apparently. And speaking of Fire Emblem Fates, I don't really have a lot to talk about here, because Fates doesn't really add anything new to the series' characterization. It just rides the curtails of Awakening, and most of what it has in place is just carried over from there because Awakening sold like hotcakes, which was a safe decision, but it doesn't really leave me with too much to talk about. The only real addition to this franchise was the My Castle feature. It was a sort of Tellius-based style hub where you could go around, buy your weapons, go to the lottery, and kinda just shoot the shit with your army for a bit. I actually really liked this feature. You could ignore it if you wanted, or you could go milk some cows with Benny. It doesn't have any sort of deep character moments like the Tellius-based conversations, but it just has your characters relaxing, which does help show them in a way that the player can further relate to, helping strengthen the cast. Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia is more of a return to form for how the characters are presented. There's no more customizable avatar, the characters are less gimmicky and more realistic, and the endings that change if people died are all still there. But it adds support conversations and base conversations to the characters, so that really does pump them up much stronger. Though the real kicker here is the addition of voice acting. Sure, Fates and Awakening had a few one-off lines for certain scenarios, and BSFE had voice acting for its whopping 4 chapters, but there's no denying the impact Echo's voice acting had on the series. People still get chills over Bakut's rant 3 years later. I don't think a single character in the game has bad voice acting. But before we finish up here, let's pay one tribute to the game's most important line.
Shut up, Tobin.
I hate my life.
And lastly, that brings us to Fire Emblem Three Houses. And how does it handle its characters? A collaboration of everything that got us here. Support conversations? Thank Binding Blade for that. Laid back relaxation periods? You can thank Tellius and Fates for that one. You really like the platonic and romantic paired endings in this game? Thank Blazing Sword and Sacred Stones. You fell in love with the incredible voice acting? Well, give a cheer for Echoes. For how much Three Houses was praised as innovative, in reality, it was just one big love letter of everything that it took to get to where it is. And before we wrap things up, there's one more thing I want to do.
Wow, this isn't Microsoft Paint. What the fuck? The video lied to me. I just figured for a video that's more personal like this one, it deserved a more personal send-off. So, I said this, but I didn't really plan out what the fuck I want to say here because I am uncoordinated. I guess really all I want to say is Fire Emblem has a big place in my heart. It's my favorite game series. I've played every entry. Haven't finished them all though. Sorry everyone that wants me to play Thracia. But I do thoroughly love the series. It has a big place in my heart. It's helped shape how I play video games, how I view writing, the friends I've made, the community I've gathered. Like, there is not a day that goes by that I don't look at myself and go, how the fuck do I have over 5,000 followers on Twitter, over 4,000 on Facebook, and over 500 subs on YouTube? Like, there is not a day that goes by that I am not thankful for all of you, for all the attention and support. It really does mean a lot to me. As does this series. I've bought the games, I've bought merchandise from conventions because Nintendo fucking hates Fire Emblem and won't make its own merch. Like, look at this. I bought this clock. Who the fuck even uses analog clocks anymore? I bought it because it's got Fire Emblem on it. And the other thing I wanted to say was, I realized I might have been overly negative in Radiant Dawn and Awakening, but understand that this is a series that has constantly been evolving, it's constantly been changing. So it's only natural that not everyone likes every individual part. No series can remain going on for over 30 years and be the exact same. Unless your name is Dragon Quest, but that is an anomaly to mankind, and we're not going to try to understand that. So please, don't get too heated. If you don't agree with what I said, I tried to make it clear that that's fine. If you like the way Arcanea does things and the characters are strictly gameplay, good for you. If you like how Awakening and Fates writes their characters, good for you. If you like all of them, none of them, that does not matter as long as you're a dick. Not a dick. Fuck. Don't be a dick. The main thing is years ago, I used to be that dick. I would go on rants and rampages for anyone that dared to disagree with me about anything in this franchise. And eventually, about a year and a half ago, I thought to myself, why? Why am I doing this? What's the point? Who's going to listen to what I have to say when I'm an unbelievable jackass? So that is why I started FEMS Paint, to sort of not be a jackass, simple as that sounds. And I just wanted to say that thank you. Thank you to all of you for giving me a platform to not be a jackass. Y'all are pretty fucking great. And I'll see you next time. I have no idea what the next video is. This one kind of drained me. So, I don't know. I'll figure something out. Meanwhile, I have to get back to Ardent Infantry only. Kill me.